showed more compassion for the people with whom you work, even those who are difficult for you, what would that look like? What would you do differently if you showed more compassion for the people with whom you work, even those who are difficult for you? That's the little tie on there. And here's another question. If others at work showed more compassion for you, what would that look like? What would they be doing differently? And I'll say that for many of us, that second question, I think, is actually more challenging. And I'll explain why in a second. So I'm Dr. Rob McKenna, and welcome to the Wild Conversation, where we make the best thinking in psychology, leadership, and organizational science accessible to leaders who are willing to learn and edit for their sake and for the sake of others. And today we are kicking off our new series on risky leadership topics. And specifically today, we are tackling compassion. And in our following weeks, we're going to get into some other things as well. So in these following weeks, we're going to tackle some real doozies like generosity, transparency, and sacrifice. Compassion, generosity, transparency, and sacrifice. Come on. But here's the deal is, why are these risky leadership topics for us to tackle? I mean, well, you take sacrifice. I think that one is a little bit maybe inherently and obviously risky. Its name explicitly describes risk, which we'll talk about when we get to that week. But what about the others? We hear these words often, and usually they're pretty cool to consider. So what's the risk? Like, what's the risk of me thinking about compassion when it comes to leadership or work? And the risk, I think, is to take them seriously for what they are. Because at that level, they aren't just our business, they get in our business. And let me explain it for a second. When we approach compassion, generosity, transparency, and sacrifice in a way that invites fundamental change and is real to our experience, like what we actually experience regarding these things, they have some things in common. So let me describe what I think are maybe four of the things that they have in common. Number one, they call out something in us that is difficult to unveil. Something that's difficult to unveil regarding our choice to do something that we hesitate to do, especially for someone who may not deserve it, or for which we will never get credit, and in fact, may be blamed. Number two, they put us on a reckless path towards seeing others better. I want to suggest to you that it's difficult to consider any of these topics. These are relational topics. And I say a reckless path because it gets a little bumpy along the way when we get deep into the deep waters of what these things are about. Number three, they call out our inability to receive any of them well. So this is where some of you are like, if you know what I'm talking about, it's one thing to be transparent, but also to allow others to be transparent with you, or to give compassion, but it's another thing maybe to receive compassion. So there's two sides to this. And the last one is what I already said, is that they get in our business. I mean that both figuratively and actually, because these are things that are affecting our capacity in our businesses every single day, but we don't talk about them that way. And I think we could have added a whole list of other topics very appropriately. We've already talked about kindness. I think there's the risk. It's a risky leadership topic when you get into the deep waters, which I've had ongoing conversations with my friend Tim Wenzel about that. Forgiveness, love, hope, suffering, courage. Like, these are big topics that have some risk attached to them. I think for some of those same reasons that I listed above. So let's go. Let's jump into compassion specifically. And compassion, when we talk about it as if it's just caring about others, it's pretty safe. I don't think it's that risky kind of topic. But compassion is actually defined as so much more. And I want to just say one thing about this, that we feel incredibly privileged as a team at Wild Leaders, is that we've had, since we have been in business, we've had a front row seat to a lot of suffering, to be frank, with many leaders and the people within their organizations. Leaders and their followers around us are suffering, and that may be some of you right now. And throughout the last couple of years, we've watched leaders choose to stay, to lay off people they had hired. We saw leaders who are suffering because they're trying to navigate impossible situations, many of which no one talks about, and they're making sacrifices that we can only imagine. Leading in its best form, I would suggest, is a compassionate act, both offering compassion to leaders and to their people, but also receiving it. So let's come out on hot. Let's come out hot. Let's put the pedal to the floor on this one, folks, and let's just go right there. Risky leadership topics, and specifically compassion. What in the world does compassion have to do with developing leaders? And even more important, what does it have to do with us? Many of you who are new friends of mine don't likely know that I struggled with severe back pain since my early 20s. At some points, my back pain was so bad that I couldn't get off the floor. And quite honestly, there were moments where this sounds kind of ridiculous to say out loud, but I wanted to die. I remember one moment where I prayed to God to take me, which seems, even as I say it now, I can't even believe that was my prayer, but it seems incredibly selfish and still does. I remember how selfish I felt in those moments because I had a wonderful wife and 2 young boys at the time. I went through 2 surgeries, the first which likely made my back worse, and the second that changed my life. If I'm honest, I think my back pain is the reason we don't have more kids. I don't know. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the things that affected me, because at the time I can remember thinking, I don't know, there's a lot of other variables going on, but I remember thinking for myself that I couldn't imagine carrying around all the baby stuff. And quite literally, I mean, the actual physical kinds of things, but also just the reality of being a parent. And quite honestly, I was barely functioning, let alone functioning well as a dad or a husband. And on top of that, surgery has never been easy for me. I don't do well with painkillers and morphine, which impacted my system. It did all of the things that you know about that happen within your system. Didn't thankfully deal with any of the addiction issues, but I had other kinds of things. And just the weeks that followed surgery for me were not fun. They were really difficult, and constant spasms, and completely froze me in place. And it was pretty horrible. I recall waking up at night during my 4-night stay in the hospital after my second surgery, slouched down in my bed because I couldn't straighten myself up. And I remember the nurse bringing me a suppository in the middle of the night to get my system going again. And as a side note, have you ever spent several nights in a hospital where other patients are recovering from surgery? It gets pretty crazy at night. Can make you feel like a crazy person because people are dealing with all kinds of pain. And here's why I tell you all that. I tell you all that because for me personally, compassion played an interesting part in my journey. I cannot tell you how many times I have been called by someone with back pain who wanted to know my story, or times when I got so tired of someone. This is the honest truth. I got tired of someone in the locker room after playing pickup basketball. Someone would say, "How's your back?" And that happened for years following. You would think that someone who had been through that kind of pain that I'd been through and that kind of trauma would immediately feel compassion for others in the same situation. But quite honestly, I don't immediately. And there are likely many reasons. And first off is that going back there has been emotionally painful for me. I don't know if that's it or I have a short memory, but it was a very low point in my life that lasted for a long time. And I would also say this, that honestly, I got really tired of people asking me about my back pain because I was over it. I was not going to be defined by my back pain, which made me kind of not a very nice. I didn't have a great response when people would ask me about it. And so, but I was tired of being defined by it. And so I think it was an interesting time for me to receive compassion. And it's also been an interesting time. Those were interesting moments for me to offer it. And I think I've gotten better about that. Now I love to talk to people about their back pain. And I think some of my thoughts on surgery and so on. But my point is this in telling you that is that compassion is a complicated thing to offer and to receive. But we must. So let's define this thing. If those of you that know me well know that I really like actually talking about what we're talking about. And compassion literally means, we don't think about this very often, but it literally means to suffer with. Passion is suffering. The COM part is with. Sharing in suffering. My friend Nate Rieger, who does a lot of work on compassion, defines it as to struggle with. And I would suggest that leading and going first is a suffering act at many moments. I hope that resonates with some of you. Like, let's just name it, because I think hopefully it normalizes some of what you experience. So what does sharing and suffering mean for us as leaders or as followers? Like, what is this all about? And I'm not going to answer this for all of us, but I hope to invite us into a conversation. That's what I hope to do. Even maybe that's the big thing, is like, even just to think more deeply about what is compassion is to suffer with. Like, what does that mean? Like, what are some of the pieces of that? So if you think about it from that perspective, to suffer with. And I think the other side that you've already heard me say is also to be open to someone suffering with you, because we have all kinds of barriers, some of us, to that reality. So let me talk through some of the things that this is about. So the first thing is that compassion is a fundamentally human need and a relational thing. It is. Why is this relevant to our businesses? I don't care if your business is a nonprofit or an actual, for-profit business, or a church, or whatever else, or community or federal government work, or whatever. Compassion is a fundamentally human need and a relational thing, meaning since our organizations are full of humans, the need is there. And here's another thing. By definition, I don't know, I'm going to say something with maybe more oomph than I fully believe, but you cannot suffer with yourself. Compassion is a relational thing. It's between us and someone else. At its core, it's about sharing in the suffering of another. And this brought up some questions for me, is that who in your life are you called to suffer with? And sometimes compassion is really difficult because it requires me to put myself in your shoes. And because it's a relational thing, it always involves both the perspective of the suffering person. So relationships are two-sided, right? A suffering person and the person expressing compassion or considering it. And sometimes this reality is that we do not receive compassion well. But we got to get better at that too. But we must. And sometimes we don't enter into the suffering of others well. The other thing is this, is that when we think about that suffering to suffer with as a definition, that involves a lot of trial and error. So in other words, because of that, compassion requires trial and error as we learn to come alongside the suffering of others, to see other people. And it might be just small points of suffering or very acute, extreme suffering. And I think that's why one of the huge lessons that we try to instill in leaders is the power of a question, an invitation to see someone else, not just their competence and their skills at work, but also where are they hurting? It's okay to keep asking, or to courageously and controversially come back to come alongside someone. But compassion or suffering with, also, here's another thing about it. It produces different challenges for different people. For some of us, our compulsion to solve it for others, I wrote this down, is maybe not really compassion, but it's more a selfish compulsion to fix it or make the anxiety for others go away. And I would suggest to you that compassion isn't compulsively fixing or deleting suffering, but suffering with. That's what the definition is. For others, the challenge is different. So we have different challenges with compassion. For others, the challenge is to pay attention to the suffering of others, to see it, even if we don't see it or we don't want to go back there again because it brings up so much pain. Another thing about it, I think it takes intention. Having experienced the same kind of pain that someone else is experiencing now does not automatically make you a compassionate person. It takes intention, even if you've been through it before. And I think that's what I experienced sometimes around my back pain, is one little moment for me, or it's actually an extended moment. And then compassion by its very nature is a sacrificial posture with another person, especially with someone who is most difficult for you to relate. To suffer with them is to see their suffering, and in so, by its very nature, must include a lot of other things, grace and a sacrificial love for another person. And then also, here's this, one more thing about this, as I was thinking about compassion and suffering, is a healthy compassion must also have boundaries. Not for the sake of protecting ourselves, but for the sake, I think, of healthy helping. A healthy compassion is not enmeshed or compulsively helpful or overly affirming. It's a person with a healthy sense of themselves saying, I'm here, or I've been there, and I get it. So it's interesting. I think so. That's a lot of things that are kind of are challenging to think about, but I think there's hope. And because suffering relates to suffering. This is why I think vulnerability has become such a powerful topic. It's because suffering relates to suffering. It relates best. Even if you have trouble dragging your suffering back out into your consciousness, there's an honesty when you have suffered. When I know someone is going into back surgery, even if I'm hesitant to talk with them, when I do, there is honesty about it. So there's sincerity, there's understanding. And I think that makes a big difference. Whatever it is that you might relate to, that suffering relates to suffering. But from a whole perspective, so let's try to, so if we were to start a conversation about this from a whole perspective, compassion is a necessary component of our reality. To suffer with you is to come alongside you, to see your reality of hardship and challenge, and to just be there with you. What would change if we were compassionate? Now, it's interesting. I want to give you three things that are about compassion before I give you a couple of questions to consider as we continue this conversation. So what are some of these components? What are some of the components of compassion? And this is going a little deeper. We go into the deep waters here, and I hope that's okay. But what are the components? And I wrote these things down. The first thing is this: a call that's hard to listen to. So in other words, to be compassionate or to receive compassion is a call to receive it or a call to offer it. I think with the people who are most difficult for us is a call that's hard to listen to. The second thing, I think the reason why it's difficult to listen to is that call is because it's an unveiling. I love that word unveiling, to even have that veil partially lifted, to say, like, what are you really feeling right now? And a removal of the idea that suffering at work isn't a thing. And I'm always mindful in that unveiling process. Like, I'm not a clinical psychologist. Quite frankly, clinical PhDs programs didn't want me, so I studied industrial organizational psychology. But that unveiling, we have to be aware of some of those boundaries even there. But it's a call and it's an unveiling. It lifts the veil on things that are difficult. So I'm not saying like lift the veil all completely. That's freaked me out. but maybe lifting a little bit. And the third part of it is a choice. A choice, not a compulsive choice, but a thoughtful choice to come alongside and understand the moments of pain and suffering and challenge that other people are facing are some of those things. So here's some questions to consider as you think deeply about this. So number one, are people in your organization willing to listen to your suffering? And I almost inserted pain or challenge, but I'm just going to go there. Let's call it suffering. Whether it's a little suffering or huge suffering. Are people in your organization willing to listen to your suffering? Number two, do you have people within your organization with whom you have opened the door to your own suffering, that you've been vulnerable a bit? Do you have those people? And instead of blaming our organizations, what role do I have in creating a space for people? Maybe I'm the first. Maybe I, step out and recklessly go first to just lift the veil a little bit so other people might see, oh, you suffered too? And then number three, when you come into a moment where someone at your work is suffering, do you avoid the compulsion to overfunction or underfunction? And do you make a choice to respond in the best way possible? Those are just a couple of questions that might light up this conversation for us as we continue to talk about compassion as that sharing and suffering.